I'm Patrick Prill, and I started off my career in management consulting and did that for a long time, and moved into the investment industry, and thankfully God helped us to do pretty well, and so I was able to quit work early. And my wife and I moved from the New York area to South Carolina, where we now live. We left, 60-degree weather. Last week was about 80. So we're learning how to play golf badly in South Carolina, which is a great place to learn how to play golf badly. I love doing apologetics kind of stuff. And this is about the 6th talk that I've done with Ratio Christi in New Jersey and Texas and now here. And this talk is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. While I was in the investment industry, I studied theology and early church history at Gordon Conwell, north of Boston. It was kind of my way of staying sane while I was in the investment industry. And the thing that really struck me about the early, they call it the patristic period, which is the early church, is just how absolutely incredibly courageous these early Christians were. And then I would contrast it to the courage that I saw at the time in my own church, and the courage I saw in the churches in my community. And it caused me to really ponder, why aren't we that courageous? And so what I wanted to do today is really just give you a contrast. To start off with the early church, how unbelievably brave that they were. And then bring it back to today, where we're going to see some people who are actually pretty courageous today. And courage is not, an extinct commodity. And the thing I hope is that for all of you, it will kind of encourage you to be courageous too. So let's start off. Let's see if this will work. I guess I'll have to click it manually. Okay, so what we're going to start off with is a dangerous world. And a defense was needed. We're going to talk about some of the early defenders. We're going to talk about the courage that's needed for today. And then we're going to wrap it up with a few of the lessons that hopefully we take back, not just for ourselves, but the churches and other Christian believers that we know. Okay? So what I thought it would be interesting to give you is just a picture of what it was really like. So a lot of you have read probably in the book of Acts, where here you had Paul and Silas. They would go on this missionary trip telling people about Jesus. And one of the early first towns that they stopped in was a city called Philippi. And as I read this in the book of Acts, I thought it was pretty interesting, because it says they brought Paul and Silas before the magistrates and said, "These men are Jews and are throwing the city into an uproar by advancing customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice." And I thought that was interesting, because okay, it's against the law. Well, is that like jaywalking? That's against the law. How big a deal was this? And why was the city in such an uproar about it? So I actually looked all this up. I looked at the Institutes of Civil Law written by Gaius, which is in the 2nd century, and the opinions of Julius Paulus, who's an early Roman jurist. And guess what? You couldn't practice a religion that wasn't approved by the Roman Senate. It was literally illegal to be a Christian. And then again, you go, okay, it's illegal, but is that like jaywalking or throwing litter in the street? No, because the penalty, according to Julius Paulus, was pretty severe. It says, those who introduce new religious doctrines, which are unknown to use of reason and by which the minds of men are influenced, if they are of higher rank, they're going to be deported. Or if inferior station, they're going to be punished with death. This is pretty scary stuff. So when the people of Philippi hear Paul and Silas saying, hey, Jesus is King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and they're inviting people to put their faith in Jesus, the people in Philippi knew, excuse me, this is against the law, what you're asking us to believe. Okay, then Paul and Silas went to the next town, Thessalonica, a similar response. So in Thessalonica, it says that the people in Thessalonica said about Paul and Silas, they said, they're defying Caesar's decrees, saying there's another king, one called Jesus. When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. So to call Jesus the King of Kings and Lord of Lords was literally treason. And that's pretty frightening, okay? And I'm going to give you an extreme example of this. So Tacitus, a first century Roman historian, gave an example of this. The treason law was coming into maturity, and an informer arraigned Apellia Virila, who was the granddaughter of Augustus's sister, the granddaughter of the emperor's sister. And on the basis of the charge that she had ridiculed the deified Augustus Tiberius and Tiberius's mother in scurrilous conversation. Now, what's so significant about this treason law, you didn't have to pick up a sword and oppose Caesar. All you had to do is say something negative. And there's actually a case where a poet said something slightly negative in a poem and was executed. This is incredibly scary stuff. So this is the sobriety that early believers had when they were hearing about the gospel and telling other people about it, because quite honestly, this was not a casual endeavor. You also had laws against tumult and sedition. Okay, remember in the book of Acts where it says that Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome? Well, that actually happened because Suetonius wrote about the event. Suetonius said that Claudius banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Christus, Jesus. Okay, so they're talking about Jesus. There's a big tumult. So what did the Romans do? They basically kicked all of the Jews out of Rome because there was such an uproar about Jesus. Then you have unauthorized associations and assemblies. And have you ever wondered why a lot of Christians, early Christians, worshiped in catacombs and cemeteries? Because burial societies are one of the few ways that you could get together as a group, because unauthorized assemblies and unauthorized associations were illegal. And people doing it, when you look at the penalty, they could be crucified or thrown to wild animals. That's pretty sobering, okay? And, you know, we think it's a big deal to get up early and go to church in the morning. What made it worse was the Romans didn't really have an organized police force. They had centurions, okay? And then you had the emperor's personal guards. But they didn't have a police force like we do today. So if someone did something wrong, you had informers, okay? And what informers would do is they would rat you out to the authorities. And you know what your reward was for ratting out your neighbor? At the time of Nero, 25% of their property. So if you were a rich Christian, how long do you think that your property would last? About a day and a half. Remember in the book of Hebrews, it talked about you sympathized with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property. So when people became Christians in this time frame, they were not just risking their lives, they were risking everything they owned. And they did it anyway. And the other thing about Rome, okay, I always thought that the Roman Empire would torture people as punishment. Torture was not really used as a form of punishment. Torture was used in the judicial process to ascertain the truth. Okay? So if I took you to court and I wanted to find out what happened, what did I find out? How did I determine the truth? I would call forth witnesses, and then I would torture you until you told me everything that you knew. And that wasn't punishment. That was part of the judicial process. Tertullian, who was in the 2nd, 3rd century, said, when Christians confess without compulsion, you apply torture to induce us to deny. Again, torture is off the charts. And Cassius Dio is a good example. He was, I'm trying to remember the exact date. He was around 3rd century-ish, Roman historian. He said, these masters and others of undoubted nobility, foreigners and citizens alike, not only plebeians, but as some of the knights and the senators were put to the torture, in spite of the fact that Claudius, at the beginning of his reign, had sworn not to torture free citizens. Welcome to Rome. You know, we talk about due process of law. I don't know that you wanted due process of law back then. You also had edicts against Christians. So Nero basically made it not just illegal to be a Christian, but punishable by death to be a Christian. And so Tacitus was talking about this, again, 1st century Roman historian. You know, Nero basically was trying to find a scapegoat for the burning of Rome, so he blamed it on the Christians, okay? And so Tacitus said to dispel the gossip, Nero therefore found culprits on whom he inflicted the most exotic punishments. These were people hated for their shameful offenses whom the common people called Christians. A huge number were found guilty. And Tacitus went on, they literally would impale people on stakes, dip them in tar, stick them in the ground, and light their banquet halls at night with Christians. That was Nero. It was unbelievable. Okay, but what if you were like still hanging out in Jerusalem, okay? So I'm not like in Rome, I'm in Jerusalem. And I've got Jewish family and friends. I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, but I've got Jewish family and friends. I had to be safe, right? Well, no. Because Hadrian wanted to get rid of the Jews because the Jews kept rebelling. So basically what he did is he made it illegal to practice Jewish rites. So he made circumcision illegal. He basically flattened the temple and built a pagan temple on the side of the Temple Mount. Okay, there was a Jewish revolt in 66 through 70 AD. There was another revolt in Cyrene, Cyprus, and Egypt in 115 AD. Then there was another revolt in Judea in 132 to 135 AD. So by the time all of this came about, Hadrian just wanted to get rid of all the Jews. He was just sick of it, okay? So he basically tried to wipe out Judaism. And the end result was he enacted a whole series of laws. Julius Paulus said, Roman citizens who permit themselves or their slaves to be circumcised according with the Jewish rite, after having had their property confiscated, shall be relegated to an island for life, and the physician who did it shall be put to death. That's pretty tough. That's really tough. Go back one. Then on top of that, within Judaism, so I'm a believer, and I just want to go to the synagogue and worship. Well, I really can't anymore, because remember Rabban Gamaliel in the New Testament? That was Rabban Gamaliel the elder. His grandson was Gamaliel II. Gamaliel II was the head of the Jewish community in Judea, and he implemented a benediction at the end of all of the synagogue services that basically would call down a curse on Christians, okay? Most Jewish historians think that that's who this is about. So you're not even welcome in the synagogue. And then by the time you get to the 2nd century, you have the Simon Bar Kokhba revolt, okay? So I don't know if any of you ever read in the book of Zechariah, it says that you strike the shepherd, the sheep will be scattered, and then right after it, it says, 2/3 of all the Jews will be killed. By the end of the Simon Bar Kokhba revolt, 135 AD, quite literally, 2/3 of all the Jews on planet Earth had been killed at the end of all these revolts. It's astonishing. Okay, so this is tough, okay? A defense is needed. So fortunately, there's some really brave souls that stepped up to the plate. And this is what they were defending themselves against. Can you believe this? It's like, on the one hand, you got just the evil Roman culture. You know, they'd leave babies on the side of the road, you know. They had chemically induced abortion back then, but the most common way is you just leave your baby on the side of the road. And the baby will be picked up either to be raised as a temple prostitute, okay, literally, or to be raised as a slave, or to be raised as whatever. They had sex resorts, gladiator games, prostitution, exposing children. The culture's morality was just horrible. And Christians couldn't participate in that. You had the government-sanctioned persecution that I just talked about. You had Jewish opposition that I just talked about. And then you have false religions off the charts. The Greek gods, Roman gods, they deified emperors, and you had to go in and worship the emperor, okay? And the Decian persecution was off the charts because they literally came knocking on your door. The city officials would go house to house. They would take you to the temple, and you had to sacrifice to the emperor. If you did not sacrifice to the emperor, you and your family would be tortured until you either sacrificed or died. If you sacrificed, they gave you a certificate called a labellum, and they literally have found these. The certificate basically attests that you and your family have sacrificed. So you're defending against that. You're defending against Egyptian gods. You're defending against all these false accusations, which were really pretty crazy. So Christians were being accused of atheism because they didn't worship Roman gods. So you're an atheist. You don't believe in our gods. They were accused of cannibalism. Why? Right?
Oh.
The Lord's Supper, the body and blood of Christ. Oh, you're cannibals. Okay? Orgies and incest. Well, Christians celebrated love feasts. So they thought, love feast, that must be a wild sex party. So Christians were being accused of that. Christians were being accused of treason, of obstinance, of burning Rome and causing disasters. So if anything bad happened, it was blamed on Christians. Okay? So there's a flood. Well, the Christians are at fault. Then you had terrible theology going on out there. You had unbelievable heresies because Christianity was kind of cool, okay, to some. And so what they would do is they would take bits and pieces of Christianity and pull it into their belief system. So a lot of these early Gnostic heresies like Manichaeism and others, they're like ideas that you would find today in Buddhism, ideas that you would find in Judaism, ideas that you would find in Christianity, plus a whole bunch of stuff that you would see like in Scientology, all mixed up in a big bag. And then, so Christians had to say, wait a minute, that's not Christianity. They had to show, you know, not just what Christianity is, but what Christianity isn't. And then you had all kinds of pagan philosophies. And then you had skeptic attacks. So you got Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, all these guys. Well, back then they had Porphyry, Celsus, and Crescens. So fortunately, a defense was needed, and the defenders stepped up to the plate. Pretty dramatic. The defense started with Jesus and the apostles. Remember when Jesus was going through the fields and his disciples were picking grain and eating it, and they were accused of breaking the law, and Jesus stepped up and said, no, they've done nothing wrong. Okay? That is a defense. The word apology means defense. It's not saying I'm sorry. It's a defense. So Jesus defended his apostles from false accusation. Here you have Matthew making a defense of Christianity in the Gospel of Matthew, and his defense was, look at all of the fulfilled prophecy. And the book of Matthew is one fulfilled prophecy after another. So you see this all through the early church. Okay, the Apostle Paul is standing for King Agrippa, saying, I've broken no law and I'm defending the resurrection. Okay? All the way down to the book of Jude. So you see this all through the New Testament. And it didn't stop with them. In the 2nd century, you had a raft of people writing defenses. And I'm going to highlight a couple of these. Aristides was an Athenian guy. He wrote Emperor Antoninus Pius. And he started off his defense by saying, all-powerful Caesar, Titus Hadrianus Antoninus, venerable and merciful, from Marcianus, Aristides, an Athenian philosopher. Guess what? He didn't write an anonymous letter. You just wrote to the most powerful guy on earth, and you used your name and where you live.
Wow.
Now, does that take some courage? And he was incredibly nice. What he was doing in this apology is he was trying to show him what Christianity was. So that's what his defense was really about. It's like, this is what Christianity is. And then he ends it by saying, henceforth let the tongues of those who utter vanity and harass the Christians be silent, and thereafter let them speak the truth. Justin, courage off the charts. Okay, they call him Justin Martyr, and guess what? Martyr was not his last name. Martyr is what happened to him, okay, for saying what he said. And he's well known for multiple defenses. And like Aristides, we know of one defense that he did, but Justin wrote the first defense, second defense, a dialogue with Trypho, which is basically a defense against Judaism. He wrote an address to the Greeks, another address to the Greeks, and an epistle to Diogenes, which is also very apologetic in nature. Okay, he wrote a bunch of others that we don't actually have. He wrote an apology against all heresies, but we don't have a copy of that today. These others we still have. Okay, and in his first apology, talk about courage. He wrote it to, again, Antonius Pius, and he says, to the Emperor Antonius Aurelius Adrianus Antonius Pius, had long names, Augustus Caesar, and to his son, so to the emperor, and to his son, and to Lucius the philosopher, and to the adopted son of Pius, a lover of learning and this, and to the sacred senate, and to the whole people of Rome. So it's like, I'm writing it to you, emperor, I'm writing it to your sons, I'm writing it to your family, I'm writing it to the Roman Senate, I'm writing to everybody in Rome. Me, Justin, son of Priscus, grandson of Bacchius, natives of Flavia, Neapolis, and Palestine. He almost gave him his street address. Okay? How much courage does that take? He goes on, he goes, I present this address and petition in behalf of those of all nations who are justly hated and wantonly abused, myself included. So what he's doing is he's basically saying, Emperor, you are presiding over a corrupt kingdom. I don't know how long he lived, but he lived long enough to write a second address. Okay? Then you have a variety of others. I'm not going to cover all of these. But Melito of Sardis is a good example. He talks about the informers. He says, the race of the pious is now persecuted in a way contrary to all precedent, being harassed by a new kind of edict everywhere in Asia. For unblushing informers and such as are greedy of other men's goods, taking occasion from the orders issued, carry on their robbery without any disguise, plundering of their property night and day those who are guilty of no wrong. Okay. Now think about what would happen in America if we had a law that said you can turn in anybody you want for anything you want and you get 25% of their property. Would this place go nuts? It would go nuts. You would have people informing on everybody for everything. Okay? And you know who they would start with? They would start with Jeff Bezos, right? They would start with, you know, all the owners of Microsoft. They would start with the billionaires and work down. It would get ugly. Here's a few more. I'm not going to cover all of these. Hippolytus was a really incredible guy. He wrote this amazing refutation of heresies. And Tertullian wrote a huge number of apologetic works also. And the thing that's interesting about all these guys, if you've noticed, some of these guys are from North Africa. Tertullian is North Africa. Okay. Some of these guys are from Athens. Some of these guys are from Rome. Some of these guys are from Asia Minor. Okay. And at the time of Antonius Pius, he had 3 different guys writing him from different areas of the empire. Okay. So it's pretty interesting to me that this whole idea of defending the faith was not a centralized idea, that everybody was doing it. Or not everybody, but in all regions of the empire it was happening. So this is what they did. And think about this today, okay? Think about this today. They affirmed Christian rights. You're persecuting us and we've done nothing wrong. They're affirming Christian character. No, we don't eat children. Okay? They're affirming the gospel of Jesus. This is what Christianity is. They're affirming Christian morality and beliefs. They're affirming the truth of Christianity, this historical truth. This really is true. They're affirming a Christian worldview and they're affirming the truth of Scripture. Okay? And they presented evidence, reason, they responded, and they made the case for Christianity. But while they were affirming, they were also opposing. They opposed unjust oppression, false accusations, false religions, heresies, bad theology, skeptics attack, human philosophies, and immorality. So when you're defending Christianity, you're affirming and you're opposing, okay? There's both sides of it. And I'm only going to give you a couple examples of these because you can go read them yourself. Athenagoras, okay? This is a quick synopsis of his history. So it took several hours to do this page, okay? He wrote a lot of stuff. Okay, again, he wrote it to Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, and Commodus. You ever see the movie Gladiator? Okay, Commodus. Okay, do you know how he was characterized in the movie Gladiator? He was worse. He was actually worse. When Nero died, the Roman Senate declared Nero to be an enemy of Rome. When Commodus died, they declared him to be an enemy of the human race. Okay? Now, Marcus Aurelius was the philosopher emperor. Okay, and he wrote this interesting book, basically his reflections to himself. And so he was known as a philosopher. So what was interesting to me is Athenagoras knew his audience. So before you talk to anybody, who are you talking to? Understand them. Where are they coming from? You know, what are the issues that they're going to have? He understood his audience. And so what you see in his response is he goes, you know, the issue in the plea, Christians are unjustly harassed, plundered, and slaughtered only for being Christian. Harassed, plundered, and slaughtered. We've committed no crimes. Please enact a law to protect us. There's all kinds of false charges against us. We're not atheists. And he talks about Plato and the Stoics. Well, why did he do that? Because his audience was a philosopher emperor. He read Plato and the Stoics. Christians are not immoral. We're not impious. We don't worship as other people do. That's true. But we're not guilty of the things that you claim we are. And gee, even the poets talked about, God and God being a unity and God being one. And he cites Homer, Orpheus, and the Stoics and a variety of other Greek philosophers. And it's so interesting to me, it's like he talked to the emperor in a language that the emperor could understand, in a way that the emperor could receive it, at the emperor's level. Smart guy, okay? Talked about the charges against Christians being baseless, and he's talking about, you're talking that we have impious feasts and incest. We don't. Virtue was always attacked. We don't even look at people with lust. But our accusers have sex markets and resorts and commit pedophilia and homosexuality. Look at our accusers. We don't do this. Christians don't eat human flesh. We don't watch gladiator games, watching people get killed on Sunday for entertainment. Okay? We don't abort babies or expose infants. Christians believe in the resurrection and accountability for God, and that's why we don't sin. And if we're wrong, we haven't done you any harm. If we're wrong, we're just guilty of folly. We've done you no harm. And then he wraps it all up and he goes, we've proved we're pious and gentle and temperate. We pray for you and your government. We mean you no harm. We're like the best citizens you have. And he goes, all we want is to lead a peaceful and quiet life and may ourselves readily perform all that's commanded of us. I'm not going to go through all of these, but Justin wrote a second apology. And this one was pretty cool because he actually came to the defense of a specific person. Okay? And it was a lady whose husband was ticked off, okay, because she was a Christian and he was out running around and doing carousing, and they ended up splitting up. And so he goes to the authorities and turns her in as a Christian, okay? And so as he's defending this lady, Justin goes, a Christian woman divorced her lecherous husband. He turned her in. She confessed her faith. He then turned in her Christian teacher, okay? And then Lucius came to their defense and he was also condemned. And then a third Christian came to their defense. He was condemned. And now I'm coming to the defense and I expect to be condemned too. Can you imagine the courage of stepping up, seeing that 3 people have been condemned before you for coming to this lady's defense, and now I'm going to come to her defense, and it's probably going to happen to me too. And guess what? It did. It did. Urbicus, the prefect of Rome, was a wretch. He's a wretch. This is just a quick snapshot. Remember I told you about they had all kinds of weird stuff back then, like Scientology type stuff back then? Okay. What's so cool about this guy is Irenaeus, 2nd century, he wrote this huge book against heresies. And the thing that blew me away about Irenaeus is, I can't remember how many volumes in this set. This is just in book 1. These are the heresies he covered in book 1. I think it was 8 volumes. And this one is Valentinius, his Gnostic philosophy. But he spent the time to meticulously understand this pagan philosophy, it would be like the equivalent of you living in Salt Lake City and spending the time to meticulously understand what the religions of that area teach and preach. Okay, it would be like you living the block across the street from the headquarters of Scientology. Okay, and you meticulously understanding what they teach so that you can speak truth in light of it. And to me, his patience and his scholarship and his willingness to do that is just astonishing. Now, we're all not called to do that, obviously, right? Because you don't live across the street from Scientology, but you live across the street from something else, okay? And so the thing that really struck me, we used to live in northern New Jersey. And northern New Jersey, it's a very smart area, okay? The town we lived in was the headquarters, was where Bell Labs was. It's like, there's all these unbelievable brainiacs. That was Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley, okay? It's like everybody's PhD in something, okay? And smart people. And our kids' high school math teacher was a PhD in mathematics who was a retired Bell Labs guy who was teaching him every function that he thought was useful in his career at Bell Labs. It's like, so the thing that we found is people were very, very smart, okay? But they were very into naturalism, okay? Because in the 5th grade, you learn that gods and goddesses are mythology. Simultaneously, you're learning that nature is self-existent and responsible for its own complexity.
Wait.
Okay? So that by the time you graduate from high school, you've really kind of embraced this whole naturalistic paradigm, okay? You've also had, 50% of our neighborhood roughly was Roman Catholicism, okay? A lot of great Catholic believers there. A lot of wonderful, wonderful Catholic believers. But I wouldn't agree with every point of theology, right? The thing that we found, though, is that the churches in the area were not engaging with, I call them the isms of our area. So naturalism was really big, okay? Everybody's really, really into their career. What would you call that as an ism? But you get what materialism, okay? Financial materialism. Everybody worked in the financial industry, everybody, So, but people weren't addressing the isms in their community. And so the thing I would challenge you and your churches is, what are the isms in your neighborhood? What are the isms in your town? And are you addressing those isms? Okay, the headquarters of American Atheists was about 20 minutes from our home in Cranford, New Jersey. I didn't know it for years. None of the churches were talking about it. Very little apologetics type of stuff going on in any of the churches. And you're just going, excuse me, their headquarters is practically across the street and you're not talking about anything? Irenaeus talked about all of the isms. I mean, like all of them. It was pretty astonishing. So here's a few lessons for today. Teach apologetically, okay? So if there were pastors in the room, what I would suggest to you is, don't just say that God created the heavens and the earth, which is true. Show evidence, okay? And regardless of what you think of, young earth, old earth, gee, why is it that Lawrence Krauss and, almost every major atheist philosopher, Steven Weinberg, they all acknowledged that the universe had a beginning from nothing. Okay, how could space, time, matter, energy, and laws all begin simultaneously from nothing? How could, no matter what your paradigm is, how could all of that have resulted in such unbelievable complexity that within a fraction of the second of the Big Bang, you have 2 up quarks and 1 down quark instantaneously combining, right, to produce a proton? Why is it that all of these laws exist instantaneously from the beginning? Okay, so when you're preaching and teaching about God created the heaven and the earth, why don't you talk about some of this? And I think the reason in a lot of cases is a lot of the pastors don't know about it. They're not equipped. And that's why groups like Ratio Christi are so important. Because what you're doing is you're asking these questions and you're combining, okay? You're combining science, history, all of these other disciplines with Christianity, and you're showing that what the Bible has been talking about for thousands of years is actually now being confirmed by science. It's like, wow, maybe we should talk about that. I think that's a pretty cool thing. So teach apologetically, affirm truth, expose evil. There's a lot of evil in this world, and we act like everything's peachy keen. Address the isms in your community. I just talked about that. Defend the church. Stand against opposition. Now there's pastors, there's a guy in England who was thrown in jail for standing 50 feet, I think, 50 feet or 50 yards, 50 feet from an abortion clinic, and all the guy was doing is he was standing quietly praying. He wasn't saying anything. He didn't engage with anyone. He did nothing. And they arrested him and put him in jail because he was praying. I think we need to defend that guy.
What was like the charge?
The police went up to him and asked him, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm praying for all of the babies, and I'm paraphrasing. I'm praying for all the babies that their lives would be saved. And they arrested him, put him in jail. And you're going, wow. And in Canada, you can't preach Romans 1 in Canada legally. Because a lot of countries, they not only have, like we have hate crimes, right? Where if you do a crime, hate crime, they have hate speech, okay? And they broadly construe hate speech to include anything that doesn't agree with their worldview, okay? And I'm going, wait a minute, we used to just call that a disagreement. We never called that criminal. And now disagreements are called criminal, and you're being thrown in jail in some countries for having a different worldview. Even though you've done nothing wrong, you've hurt no one. It's pretty crazy stuff.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Sure.
You mean literally they cannot preach, they cannot use Romans 1 as a text, or just certain topics in it they can't talk about?
You cannot talk about homosexuality being a sin.
But they can preach something else from there.
Oh, you can preach from the passage so long as you don't say that.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, but that's what the passage says.
No,
So you have to change what it says to preach it, which is kind of a strange thing. And again, it's like, there's a lot of, like, I don't agree with a lot of different religious views and things, but it's not criminal. It's like, you can come and, if you have a different faith, we can talk about it. It's like, you're free to speak whatever you want to say. In America, we have freedom of speech, right? So if you're a Hindu and you're in your Hindu church and you're preaching Hindu doctrine, that's not illegal. You're free to do that. You're free to teach what your texts convey. But now it's becoming illegal in some countries to actually just teach what Christianity says.
yeah.
And it requires a defense. The other big thing is like, you, right? You know your gifts, you know your passions. play your position,
Okay.
right? You know you. Now, engineering types, okay? You're wired a certain way, okay? You're wired differently than I am. I'm not wired that way. But you engineering types, it's like play your position. Use your brain in that way. You know, it's like you're gifted to do things I'm not. You history types, you know, you social justice types, you know, your passions, okay? Your gifting, use them and play your position. Don't try to play somebody else's position. I don't think I could do what Irenaeus did. But Irenaeus played his position. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a second. So here's a couple of quick lessons for today. Okay, the questions that we need to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, okay, are we vigilant defenders? And I'm giving an example from the Old Testament. This is from Isaiah 56, where God kind of called out the leaders. He said, come you beasts of the field, come and devour you beasts of the forest. What do you mean come and devour? Because Israel's watchmen, the guy who are supposed to protect you, the guys who are supposed to be watching out for you, are blind. They lack knowledge. They don't even know what's going on. They're mute. They're mute dogs. They can't bark. They lie around and dream. They love to sleep. They're dogs with mighty appetites. They never have enough. They're shepherds who lack understanding. They all turn their own way, each seeking his own gain. Come, each one cries, let us get wine, let us get our fill of beer, and tomorrow will be like today, or maybe even far better. So we all get caught up in our own stuff, okay? Sometimes we get caught up into pleasure. We get caught up in our own lives. But when we're in a position of responsibility, okay, we got to put our stuff second, okay? And when we see brothers and sisters in Christ going through the ringer, and we're sitting here, you know, comfortable, fat and happy, you know, it's like, come on, what would you want somebody to do if you were in their spot? So the first question is, are we defenders? And how seriously do we take it? The second question is, how wise are we? Because defenders aren't supposed to just be crazy out there doing stuff. They're supposed to be wise. So this one's from Colossians. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so you may know how to answer everyone. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reasons, not just because somebody told you. You have a reason for what you believe, for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. Okay, nobody wants anybody to get in their face, right? You treat people with kindness, with respect. You behave wisely. You don't just blurt things out, okay? You play your position. You defend what we believe, but you do it wisely. And you do it courageously. It says, don't be frightened, but in your hearts, set Christ apart as Lord. He's our boss. He's our Savior. He's our boss. A couple quick examples of courage today, and then we'll wrap this up. And the reason I'm putting this in is we all have a role to play, okay? And some of you are going to go into media. Some of you are going to go into engineering. Some of you are going to go into medical fields. Some of you, you're all going to go into different fields, right? But no matter what you go into, you can be a defender. First example, how many people have heard of this young lady? Courageous. Oh my goodness. Collegiate swimmer. And she was just fed up. with having to compete against guys. And she goes, no, this is wrong. This is wrong. And she's defending a Christian worldview. Now, is she a theologian? No. Is she a historian? No. She's an athlete. But she has the courage to stand up and defend a Christian worldview as an athlete. And she's taken all kinds of hits. You know, protesters consistently try to shout me down. University administrators try to cancel my speaking events. At San Francisco State University, I was physically assaulted by an angry mob, locked in a classroom and held for ransom for over 3 hours. And this is a girl just trying to stand for truth. She has courage. And then you got Christian ministries. I'm going to highlight 2 of them. Okay. During the 2000s, the state university system in California was kicking all these Christian ministries off campus. So Chi Alpha stood up and said, enough. You know, they lawyered up. They took the state of California to court. And guess what? You know, after they'd been deregistered in Cal State, they got legal counsel, then negotiated with the state university system, and then they were reinstated on Stanislaus, Sacramento, San Diego, and Fresno campuses without compromising their beliefs. InterVarsity, okay? InterVarsity got kicked off of about 40 campuses where they were being challenged, okay? They drew the line in the sand at the University of Iowa. And it turns out 38 other Christian ministries at the University of Iowa were being pushed off of campus because they wouldn't sign a piece of paper that says evil is good. Okay? So InterVarsity said enough. They lawyered up. They went to federal district court, and Ohio's action was found unconstitutional by federal district court. And all those ministries are back on campus again. They defended their right to be Christian on campus. They defended their right to not have to deny Christian morality on campus. So if any of you turn out to be attorneys, we need Christian attorneys, okay? Now, engineers and scientists. Okay, the first guy is Ian Hutchinson, plasma physicist at MIT. He became a believer when he was at Cambridge because a couple Christian guys started showing him how Jesus really is a historical person. And he got intrigued and he started reading about it. He became a Christian, okay? Cy Gart, okay? He is I have physics on here, actually that's wrong. He is, I think, biochemistry. So I need to make that change. And then you have Sarah Salviander, astrophysics. And what's interesting about all 3 of them is they're former atheists. And now they're very vocal Christians, okay? Very vocal in the context of physics, chemistry, and astrophysics to defend their faith. And then you have James Tours, a really interesting guy. He is a synthetic chemist. Okay, and what he has discovered is, regardless of what anybody tells you, nobody has a clue as to how human life began, how any life began. Because there's so many things that had to happen simultaneously. The way that chemistry works, and you can read his books on this stuff, is life had to have happened quickly, incredibly quickly, or because time is not favorable to the chemical reactions that are required for life to happen. Okay? And what's doubly interesting about him is doubly courageous. Not only is he speaking at universities across the country, but he was raised Jewish. He's a Messianic Christian. He's a Messianic believer. Follows Jesus. So he has a double measure of courage. And then you have all these Messianic ministries. Now, when I was a kid, there weren't a lot of them, okay? There were Jews for Jesus and a few others. Now there's Chosen People's Ministries, Jews for Jesus, Association of Messianic Congregations. These are Messianic Jewish denominations now, okay? The International Messianic Jewish Alliance, and then the MJAA, and the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. And this is a guy we know from New Jersey, former Orthodox Jewish guy who's now a believer, who stayed in his Jewish community. And we have another friend in northern New Jersey who's a Messianic rabbi who stayed in Livingston, New Jersey, okay? Which is like 75% Orthodox Jewish, okay? Telling Livingston, New Jersey that Jesus is the guy. How much courage does that take, right? He's not out there preaching to Christians. He stays in the Jewish community telling Jewish people that Jesus is the Messiah. And are you thinking about politics? This guy, believe it or not, he was an HVAC guy. He was never in politics in his life. He started an HVAC company, built it up to 1,500 employees. Okay, I went to prayer. We had this kind of men's thing in Tennessee. We'd get together every now and then. And he goes, guys, this may sound crazy. I'm thinking about running for governor. You know, pray for me. I need to really know that this is what I'm supposed to do. He ran for governor and he won. Okay, and now he is taking a stand against all the puberty blockers and hormone stuff. Okay, and the thing is he is leading in Tennessee in a way the Democrats and Republicans are united on this issue. Okay, this is a guy who is defending Christian morality in politics, who never thought about ever getting involved in politics. John Lennox, you've all heard of, right? Very academic kind of guy, British. Nabil Qureshi is, he passed away a few years ago of cancer. He's very interesting. Has anybody heard of the Qureshi? Have you ever heard of the Quraysh tribe? What's significant about the Quraysh tribe?
Lots.
That's Muhammad's tribe. Okay. Nabil Qureshi, his last name is kind of like Muslim royalty, okay? And he, while he was searching for Allah, found Jesus. And then finally you have Lee Strobel. Let's not forget this guy.
Yeah.
Corey Miller. This is the guy who founded Ratio Christi. He was raised in a Mormon home.
I didn't know.
Fourth generation.
Okay?
What's his name?
Corey Miller, right?
But sorry, he didn't found it. He's the president.
He's president.
That's tough.
Okay.
He was our president.
He's like the second president.
He's the second president. Yeah.
Okay. Years ago, I went in for my final interview. I was interviewing at Deloitte & Touche, okay, management consulting practice. So I'd gone through all the preliminary interviews. I was in my final interview, okay, with the head of the Atlanta office, and at the time, I believe he headed the whole Southeast region. Okay, I go in for the interview. I sit down at his desk. Okay, this is the big guy, right? And what do I see on his credenza? On his desk, an open Bible. Okay, his view is we're Deloitte & Touche. We follow generally accepted accounting principles. We follow international financial accounting standards, but I follow this book as my standard of morality. So every partner, everybody who went into his office saw an open Bible on his desk as his statement that this is how we will run this firm, okay? Turns out that after, that was with Deloitte Haskins and Sells, they merged with Touche Ross. He ended up the head of the firm globally, Deloitte & Touche International. Yeah. Okay. What was so interesting about him is he was a defender of the faith by just stepping up and being visible, saying, I'm a Christian. Nobody in that firm, okay, would do anything against a follower of Jesus Christ because he made it visible, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, and this is the book that I follow. That's a kind of a silent defense, but it's a defense. Then you have all the movies, Christians in sports, and then the conferences. So this is what's wrapping it up. My final question is, there's all these people in the first century, unbelievable courage. We see people stepping up the plate today, unbelievable courage. How courageous are you? How courageous am I? How courageous are we? God doesn't call us to step out and do something stupid and step in front of a truck, right? But God calls us where we are to use the gifts, talents, abilities, and opportunities that He gives you to represent Him well and to defend Christian belief, Christian brothers and sisters, and their right to be Christian. So what I hope that you will all do is embrace the role. And it's not one-dimensional, okay? It's not just about science. It's not just about history. You can be a defender of the faith in any profession that you're in, okay? My daughter's in nursing, and she has stuff that she has to take a stand against, okay? It's like you can be a defender no matter where you are. So my encouragement is, let's do this thing. That's it.
Thank you.